geopolitics at DP World in the United Arab Emirates, and last but not least, our moderator, Carlos Roa, visiting fellow at the Danube Institute here in Budapest. The floor is yours.
There we are. All right, good. Well, good morning, everyone. Kind of pleasant to have you all here, and thank you for having me and having us all. We already got the introductions down, so that saves me a bunch of time. I'm going to open up with kind of a scene setter, since there are a bunch of people who are not aware of what the India, Middle East, European Economic Corridor is, and it's helpful to provide some background. So let's open up with that. For the past few years, there's been rising issues with connectivity, supply chain resiliency, and so forth. Some of us may recall the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, or various conflicts, and so on and so forth. So IMEC was started, conceived as a means of opening new corridors, a new corridor and new alternative trade routes to building trade resiliency. It was signed, came into being in September 2023. Aside the G7 summit, and then 1 month later we had the Gaza-Israel war, and things kind of turned cold briefly. But even though the geopolitics has been slow-moving, the business case has still been ongoing, and there's been much interest in this. So in past 2 years, ever since the announcement of IMEC, there's been progress on the India to Middle East aspect, and some progress as well, not as much, on the Middle East to Europe aspect. And interestingly, there's now something kind of a three-way lobbying battle over which port in Europe will be the main recipient of this new trade. Will it be Piraeus in Greece? Will it be Marseille in France? Or will it be, now more recently, Trieste in Italy? So let's get right into it. We have with us Bharat. To help flesh out what I just said, how can IMEC complement or supplement the existing trade routes in a world where trade concerns are now the most prominent they have been probably ever?
Thanks very much for having me, Carlos, and it's a pleasure to be here. Look, from an international trade and business standpoint, the IMEC represents a strategic intervention in the reconfiguration of international trade. This is to say that it's actually focused on enabling a diversification of trade routes, diversifying supply chains, unlocking new markets, and what have you. Now, let me just share a few figures with you for your consideration. IMEC connects about 2.25 billion people. That's 25% of the world's population. Let that sink in for a minute. The second is that the economies that IMEC would connect make up for about $47 trillion with combined GDP. That's 40% of global GDP. Let that sink in for another second. Now, from our estimates, in comparison to the traditional Suez Canal route, IMEC would reduce, or rather be faster, by 35 to 40%, 25 to 30% cheaper. In fact, our estimates also suggest that 150,000 TEUs of annual cargo could shift to IMEC if all goes well. So if you ask me for a business case, it's all there. This is a business case that pretty much writes itself. Let me focus for a second on the India Middle Eastern component of the larger IMEC project. This is already an established trade route, a trade corridor that's been in existence for generations, of course, and over time become more efficacious and beneficial for both those countries. Now, the corridor, of course, will extend and elevate existing trade between both those countries to a reasonable degree, no doubt. But given the fact that it's well established, you have three large ports, Nhava Sheva in Mumbai, Kandla in Gujarat on the Indian side, and Jebel Ali in Dubai. So, this is something that's already there. It's a template that is available to help replicate this in other parts of the IMEC corridor. Let me speak to you for bilateral trade, for example. Non-oil bilateral trade between India and the UAE is almost $100 billion. That's a significant amount of money. Now, the UAE-India SEPA, which is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, removes tariffs on a variety of goods. And that actually, boosts trade to a large degree as well. So in many ways, the physical infrastructure has been there, as I mentioned. We have something called the Bharat Mart, which is, Bharat in Indian translates for India Mart, which in other words provides small and medium enterprises and traders in India access to a whole world out there as a result of this initiative. There are free zones in Jebel Ali as well. Digital infrastructure exists already to some degree, which is a virtual trade corridor between both those countries, for example, on customs, is already there. So what I think trying to get at is that there's already commercial value that has been unlocked to some degree. There is a blueprint available to help replicate that in other parts of the IMEC corridor. Now, of course, there are practical details of the implementation and operationalization of the corridor in itself. But I think on the whole, the corridor is viable to a large degree. So let's just repeat that again. Diversifying trade routes, diversifying trade corridors and alternative trade corridors. And the third, of course, bringing in large-scale private sector investment. All three speak to the immense potential that this particular corridor has already. Let me also mention that transport costs are set to become one of the biggest obstacles for businesses that are seeking to increase exports around the world. This, again, is a corridor that would actually alleviate that problem to a large degree. And within global trade, of course, we're seeing around us disruption being caused by all kinds of problems, not least geopolitical. But then that's, I would argue, a reason why a corridor like IMEC becomes even more critical and relevant in today's day and time.
Thank you for that. Nicholas, do you share this view? And what is the French view on this, I should say?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will not speak here as a French, right? Let me be very clear. Because by design, what we are discussing about with the IMEC project is a multilateral project. And let me just reposition this discussion first. Within the discussions we have today and yesterday and the past days here in Budapest, I think this is one of the very rare opportunities we have not to criticize something or say things are wrong, etc., but to showcase an actual very large-scale investment project or process. So we are looking forward in a way that includes investments, geopolitics, continental trade agreements, and so on. So that compels us to look ahead. That's the first point. Second point, if you look somehow about the multilateral genesis of the IMEC project, in 2022, when in the G20, this partnership for global infrastructure investment approach was coined, it was largely a result of a few years before, and I've been co-chairing the infrastructure task force in the group of think tanks of the G20 since the G20 Japan, in 2019. So, been witnessing the evolution of the discussion. On the one hand, you had China pushing the BRI project, and that was the one and only global approach where you could see a pattern of investment and development. And the G7 regularly tried to cope up with that and never succeeded. And then you could see how much there was a convergence between different approaches, that yes, large-scale infrastructure development projects or corridors are a way of development in the 21st century. Why? Because you are including nation states, but not only nation states. You are including very powerful investors, but not only investors. You are taking into account the need to develop trade, but you also take into account the fact that geoeconomics will not thrive with, if not taking into account, for example, large-scale environmental transformations or resources approach transformations, and so on and so on. And there was a moment, right, linked with the COVID and the immediate aftermath of the COVID, like where the global community was saying, we need to recover together. That was the motto of the G20 in Indonesia, recover stronger, recover together. And somehow, at this moment, ways to promote investment through the large-scale development corridors re-emerged very strongly. Interestingly, the IMEC project was then kind of formalized within the G20 during the G20 of India as one very strong way to encompass such a vision. In the meanwhile, I must say that if you look in India per se, but also in Africa, in Latin America, and I see friends here in Central Asia, with the middle corridor, there are other large-scale corridor approaches, right? And the IMEC, I think, is part of this new generation of transformations. If you allow me just one more comment. After it was initiated, and this created a lot of fuss and interest, there was an immediate downturn. Well, this might just be one more announcement, because in the G7, somehow in the G20 a bit less, but it is a cemetery of initiatives about large-scale infrastructure projects that have led to nothing. So a big question immediately emerged right after the G20 India as the G20 moved to Brazil, so very far away from the shores of India to the Middle East to Europe, whether this could be sustained. And then, of course, for a few months, nothing much happened. And then, very interestingly, there started to be competition in Europe. You mentioned that, right? Will it be Trieste? Will it be Marseille? Will it be Pires? And then what about Haifa and others? And what about existing investments already in place in the Emirates, and they're linked with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf country? And what about in India, and so on and so on? And that's extremely healthy, because it's a sign that people want to be part. And there have been a number of, I say, occasions, think tanks meetings. There was a very large conclave in Delhi, mid-April. We went last week with the ORF in Marseille, with the Mediterranean, and so on and so on. France has appointed an IMEC special envoy. Italy has appointed an IMEC special envoy. Greece is very keen to promote. So where we are now, I think, is a very interesting moment, and it's also interesting that we can have this discussion here in Hungary. We need to continue talk about IMEC, and IMEC is a fantastic driver to rethink transcontinental trade and development and co-development in, I would say, in innovative ways, right? So let's not have our conversation, oh, it should go to Marseille, or it should go to, it could go to Marseille, it could go to Trieste, it could go to Greece, it could go to Hungary at the same time. Even in the Middle East, right? Egypt was not really part. So if you discuss with partners in Egypt, they say, well, yes, it's outrageous, the Suez Canal and so on. And somehow there is no contradiction. Yes, it could go also through Egypt. I mean, there are many ways, right, for such a large projects to be unfolded. The very important thing I would say is that at the EU, and I will close my few remarks here for the moment, is that Europe should consider this project very seriously. At this moment, fortunately or not fortunately, it's for you to decide, but EU institutions have not really grappled with the seriousness of the IMEC project. So there will be an EU global gateway meeting, important summit in October. Let's see, right? In parallel, the BRICS, and we had a lot of very interesting insights about the BRICS, will be chaired by India next year, right? So that might be a chance for discussions that like we have here to really strengthen the case both for continued and open discussions about, I would say, competition and cooperation for such a project to be developed in Europe, in the Middle East, also in India. And then, of course, the granularity, step by step, should also be refined so that in parallel to the grand plan and to establishing cultural and scientific links, like with the trans-IMEC scientific corridor, there can be more, I would say, concrete discussions about should there be an EV production site here, should there be, I don't know what, in other regions, and so on and so on. But the EU, the Europe as an institution, will, if it misses the turn of IMEC, then it will be a multilateral approach without the EU, and that will probably be a damage. But even without that, I think there is a very, very strong momentum at this moment.
A lot to unpack there. But I'd say, in general, you touched upon some very important points, mainly that even though there's a lack of, not say at the moment, high institutional focus on making this happen, the business case, as Brad also noted, is very strong, and there's a lot of movement on the ground, so it's less of a top-down initiative and more increasingly a bottom-up initiative. And there are various countries who you wouldn't think at first are interested in participating in the initiative that are. This brings us to, like, we're in Budapest, we're in Hungary, a landlocked country, so Peter, let's go to you, since what is Hungary's interest in IMEC, since it's not as obvious from the get-go?
I think if you look at the economic backdrop, some of which Bharat has already highlighted some numbers, I think there's a very clear business case here. So at the risk of boring you with some additional figures, if you look at the containers moved from India and Middle East to Europe, it has, from 2023 to 2024, it has seen a 12% growth. And if you go back another year, the growth is a whopping 35%, which is much higher pace of growth than the global rate of container traffic. So I think it's very clear that this cargo is coming, and Hungary has always positioned itself as a node to redistribute some of that cargo, even that's not destined to Hungary per se. And in that sense, I think it's not just an opportunity. I think from a competitive standpoint, one might almost venture to say that it's a necessity to be involved in this corridor. IMEC is not a theoretical concept. As you've seen, there's already cargo moving along this corridor. Along its backbone, there are huge infrastructures that are already been operating. Jebel Ali, operated by DP World, Khalifa Port, and elsewhere. So we are not just drawing dots and lines on a map. This is already functioning. So I think the challenge is more to frame it, to streamline it, to connect stakeholders, to make it more efficient. And in that sense, I think Hungary, there's a clear interest in this. There could be a clear interest in the sense to serve that traffic as it's arriving to Europe, because cargo is like water, so it always finds a way to flow to its destination. So if you are not ready to serve it, somebody else will be.
Fair enough. And let's go from there and jump towards a broader question for you all. Let's start with Bharat. What then, if this is more increasingly a bottom-up initiative, what's the role of transnational, the private sector in making this happen? And how can governments help ensure private participation in making this happen?
Thanks. I want to just echo what Nicholas said earlier about, none of this, the entire conversation is no longer about mutually exclusive, as Peter and I spoke earlier. So it doesn't matter through which route it goes in. The idea is this place, and this project is viable, therefore. But then, obviously, there are challenges, and that's something that all of us here certainly acknowledge. For example, rail capacity in the Middle East is something that's inadequate and needs to be built up. Some estimates suggest that it's about $20 billion or something like that, the amount of investment needed to build up rail, road, and port infrastructure in that region. Simplified border crossing protocols need to be established. And so, it's not that these challenges can't be surmounted, but it's to point out that these exist, and it's something that will be worked through as time goes by. Now, as an integrated supply chain logistics company, we see an opportunity here to support and collaborate with governments who are seeking to be a part of this corridor. And wherever we find those opportunities, we'll certainly, offer our support and our services. Now, if you were to look at this purely from an investor standpoint, given larger macro trends, which I pointed out earlier, I think it's fair to say that investors are a bit risk-averse. And so it's important, therefore, that projects like these are also sort of seeing a strategy to de-risk those investments. And I think to some degree, the corridor that I mentioned to you with regard to the India-UAE offers comfort as well, given that there's already scale at play. Now, we engage governments already in our efforts to speak about the importance of building on trust, to build in supply chain resilience, and to bring down the barriers to trade and investment. This is something that we do regularly, and I have to say many governments are obviously very, very supportive of that effort as well. Now, obviously, I can't stress enough the importance of private and public collaboration in this, because ultimately you do need that sort of partnership and that symbiotic relationship to unlock significant value. And that's something that a company like ours has done well in different parts of the world. Let me just give you a quick example just to sort of maybe buttress Peter's point about the fact that this is not just a theoretical concept. In our relations with the government of Somaliland, where we operate the Berbera port, we've been able to unlock significant value for the Berbera economic corridor as a result. So what I'm trying to say is, when you're able to move forward with governments in a collaborative spirit and bring in the kind of private sector investment you need, I think it's possible to transform a particular zone of trade into a, sort of a major trade hub, which is evident today in the Horn of Africa. Now, replicating this impact across the IMEC corridor is something that I mentioned earlier as well is possible to do. But again, there are practical examples that we at DP World have been able to demonstrate. And we're certainly here to offer our support and our services to governments that require them in any which way. And so, we look forward to that possibility as well in the future.
Nicholas, kind of ask the same question. So, role of private sector, or even brought it out to the nonprofit sector in helping making this initiative happen?
Yes, there's one good sign that there is an interest about IMEC. We could ask ourselves, is there really a need for IMEC, right? With or without IMEC, would those investments take place or not? Probably a number, but if we want to change scale, right? And you were completely right, both of you, to remind about the evolution and the rapid evolution of trade of goods between South Asia, India, and Europe that has been expanding over the past few years. There is a demand for IMEC. If you go here and there, this triggers interest. And there would be different views, like if you are running, I don't know, if you are investing in a large-scale, let's say, hydrogen project, for example, you would want to know where, when, with whom, etc., right? In some cases, the answer will not be easy to give, but the benefit from setting up the scene with a multilateral project like this is that there can be then involvement of private banking, there can be involvement also in different forms of blended finance, including public development banks. I'm thinking for Europe about the EIB, and so on and so on. We are not yet completely there. We are far from having a kind of very nice integrated pathways. And if you discuss with, let's say, private sector partners, which would not be, let's say, port developers or shippers, there are a lot of questions, right? And if you subdivide IMEC. And if you look closer, like in some case, some region, some port area in India or in the Emirates or in Saudi Arabia and so on, it's a little bit different because the granularity becomes a bit more precise, and you will see that some projects are going on and some of them require an additional critical mass, and that for others, I'm thinking for example about undersea cables or communication networks or forms of secure digital payments, you will need another layer of decision making that cannot just be achieved by players in the private sector, right? But I would like to add two dimensions to this. First one is how much somehow, especially in the context of now, right? And we have been talking about divides and fragmentations and so on and so on and so on. IMEC is quite the opposite of this, right? It's trying to secure and set up a route with different components and maybe with different entry points or endpoints that are all about connectivity and linkages. So there is, if you look Indian, for example, higher education and research institutions in the Gulf, they are becoming growingly interested in that. When we are like portraying IMEC, we need to think also about issues of job creation, issues of creating jobs, including for younger generations, high quality or not so high quality jobs, about education, and somehow it's an occasion about emphasizing an open and positive dialogue across civilizations. So it's very far away, I understand, from saying in that port area, should we create a new crane or a new automatic system? But also, I think it's also a very important and interesting part of the discussion. In that regard, I would say it's not either or. And as Bharat was saying, it's a fantastic opportunity both in different segments of the corridor, in bilateral relations that can take place, but also in a more multilateral approach for a very productive, growth-oriented, development-oriented dialogue between large-scale private sector players and governments to take place. I'm not trying to be like over-optimistic or to think in abstracto, because the reality is very harsh, right? And at the moment, if you look at the situation in the extended Middle East, right, be it in Israel with Gaza or be it in Iran, you would say, gosh, this is, we cannot go through, right? And yet, at the same time, there is an understanding that, yes, we need to go through. So again, and maybe we will finish with this, I was mentioning the BRICS. Next year, the US should be sharing the G20, right? And the Prime Minister of India was in Canada the last day. So this might be, IMEC per se will not be a driver for peace alone, right? But it is certainly also a conduit so that things that are connected to the IMEC project are being kind of looked at as ways to promote trade in difficult times and to promote connectivity and dialogue in such difficult times, including with the private sector.
Again, once again, pretty comprehensive there. Peter, do you want to add on this?
Well, my short answer to your question is to foster dialogue. If you look along the corridor, there are obviously public and private stakeholders, but they all know their own profession. And I don't think anybody has to reinvent the wheel here. The idea is to bring them together to foster dialogue. So, there are discussions like this around the future of IMEC. What are the trade flows that we can expect in the future? What could be infrastructure bottlenecks that could hamper its development? Where do services have to be improved? I think that's the key. I mean, and if you allow me a shameless plug, obviously the association that was set up earlier this year in Trieste Summit serves that. That's the basic idea. Bring all these stakeholders together, have them in-depth discussions about what's necessary, and then we can identify the challenges that we need to overcome to improve the efficiency and the outlook of this corridor.
Let's try to take both of your points together. There is the need to foster discussion, dialogue, and cooperation, but there's also the challenge of conflict and other issues that block this from happening, such as the current conflict between Iran and Israel. So how do we manage discussion and progress on this, even amidst conflict? If anyone wants to tackle this one.
That's an extremely difficult question. I mean, that's not just the question itself, but the way to answer it. And honestly, in the past 18 months, I've been part of a number of very, I would say, multilateral think tanks meeting with, including countries which are on the little bit the periphery, on the edge of IMEC, including in the Middle East, like Oman or Qatar, or in Europe or in India, etc. So, how to deal with this? I'm not a defense specialist, right? I'm a regular citizen. I've got no idea how to, I would say, conduct a war, etc. But I have a few ideas of how to connect with others, how to build solid dialogues, how to promote investments, and so on. So let's continue to do it. That's the first point. Then how to operate a bit concretely, not just purely philosophically. I think, and we have good examples here in Hungary, for example, that think tanks play a very important convening and catalytic role, and that we can see it with Bharat and with other, I would say, large-scale private sector organizations. They are also working at a scale where they can devote a small portion of their resources to do foresight analysis, to invest. Like last week, for example, the Resina dialogue in Marseille was with the big shipper CMA CGM, right? And they were very supportive, and so on and so on. That's a way not to lose track of how to interoperate private investments and then have this vision which is not just top-down, which is not just bottom-up, which is like a kind of a constant dialogue between those dimensions, continue to emerge and develop. And maybe, yes, there will be a meeting of Sherpas and Ministry of Foreign Affairs of countries that are the signatories of IMEC and the G20 and others in Trieste in Italy, and that's fine, right? And maybe there will be other meetings in Greece, and that's fine. Let just not governments be completely and solely responsible for that, and let a conduit of connecting points through private sector organizations and think tanks be also in charge of improving the conditions of the dialogue, refining the understanding, including refining how you can overcome and you can build responses to conflicts, but also to post-conflict. That will not resolve everything. The level and the magnitude of the uncertainties are huge, right? But on the other hand, there's a kind of convergence, whether you look at a number of countries which are in G7, in G20, where you look at BRICS perspective, where you look at G20 perspective from the US. So if that can contribute to strengthen positioning the IMEC project in uncertain times and times of high conflictuality, then let's do it, right? I know it's not the perfect answer, but I think there is enough room for such voluntary aspect to be realistically be emphasized and taking place.
Carlos, I would just add that, you know, when the Ukraine conflict broke out, we saw, you know, the impact that it had on costs across the world. This is basically reiterating the point that I made earlier, that conflict situations are not likely to go away. This is something that we have to live with. Businesses have to learn to live with it and surmount these challenges. But the point really is that is really why more trade routes are essential. Alternative trade routes are an absolute essential requirement to be able to ensure that the free flow of trade can take place. And so I think, just to add to what Nicholas said, it's absolutely vital that we not let conflicts and issues and disruptions prevent from the larger goal of establishing a world order that actually allows for the smoother flow of trade to take place.
Conflicts and challenges will persist, but nonetheless, this keeps on going, the show goes on, trade keeps on happening. So for the purpose of realizing IMEC, what should be the ideal next steps? This is to all of you, since we're also kind of winding down the clock a bit here, so.
Well, I can only just repeat what I said earlier. Let's get stakeholders together and get the discussion more specific to identify what's needed. I think digitalization, as also Bharat alluded to, would be a huge thing. I think it's underappreciated, the sheer number of stakeholders involved in just for the sake of an example of transporting a container from, say, Mumbai to Trieste or Marseille. All of those, many of those obviously are under different jurisdictions, they're different sectors, some private, some public, and even just to get the data flow to work well and to be available to all of them, and could be a huge gap. And that's something, for example, that I think is one aspect that where we can make huge gains in increasing the efficiency of this corridor.
So we are talking about IMEC, but more and more you will see a different range of potential stakeholders, from nations to private sector investors to operators to others, talk about IMEC Plus. Right? So there is not already IMEC, but we are already talking about IMEC Plus. Somehow this IMEC Plus, or the Plus, is there is room for participants, including countries other than the original signatories. That, I think, is very important. And if you look back in the past 5 or 6 years, about all infrastructure-related discussions within the multilateral fora, be it G20, be it G7, BRICS a little bit less so far, right? This is the first time with the IMEC project, I might be wrong, but let's say one of the very rare opportunities where we are talking about a very large-scale initiative spanning across various continents on land and at sea. It is also the very first time we are crossing the lines with various political sets of organizations. The Gulf Cooperation format is not the EU format, India is a sole nation state, and so on and so on. And I think we have been talking more than enough here about the need to be able to be more flexible with policy responses to ongoing challenges, etc. The IMEC offers this kind of flexibility. The other thing is, and that might be a way also to consolidate a little bit the vision, then let's see what happens, right? Is that IMEC is not just India in the region, it's also this kind of Indo-Pacific logics, and I don't remember, someone I think yesterday was mentioning, we were talking about the Indian Ocean, and now we need to talk about Indo-Pacific, but that's true, right? Because somehow when you look very concretely at this moment, how much India and, for example, Vietnam are discussing, including about trade and port development and so on and so on, if you kind of plug in things through this multidimensional IMEC logics, then you can go as far as Vietnam and then even continue further, right? So let's be very, very open about what it means concretely to create a kind of trade backbone that exists somehow in small pieces or large chunks, right? But which are not really coordinated and which do not benefit from a again, multilateral support, including some dimensions which could be transatlantic, including some dimensions which could be more Mediterranean, including some dimensions in the very high levels of conflictuality in the Middle East. But there are other regions of conflict in Africa, not so far from the regions you were mentioning, and which are also very strong. And then crossing the Indian Ocean, on the Indian Sea, towards India. And all those dimensions, the more there will be discussions about where to invest and how, and connect with very realistic ways to, say, implement such free zone area, etc., and connect that with, I would say, midterm or longer-term discussions, I think we will find reasons, including, for example, to associate countries which are not in the immediate epicenter of the backbone, like Hungary, in that process. And this might take place. There is a chance that it takes place. We will see, let's say, probably if we would meet again in a year from now here, in June of 2026, hopefully it's not completely unrealistic, despite the number of hurdles we have been talking about, to say that we would be able to talk about some progress in those different dimensions.
I think both Peter and Nicholas have sort of covered most of the angles there. I just say that the fact is that these conversations are taking place, and that in itself is an encouraging, heartening sign, despite the times that we live in. And I think it's important for us and platforms like this to continue doing so. And to that degree, I'm thankful that ORF and HIIA have also had this panel, because this is the kind of conversation that, spurs interest, of course, in folks who don't know enough about it, but also, to a large degree, keeps the conversation moving.
Any closing thoughts from any of you? Or, well,
one last one, since you were mentioning the convening role of ORF, but also the Hungarian Institute of International Relations. If more energy and more intelligence and I would say more practicality also and more vision are being put into the IMEC project, that can resonate also at the European level. Germany is being gradually more and more interested and involved and so on and so on. Then this can also contribute, maybe I'm being here a little bit too optimistic maybe, but this can contribute to redesign the approach of development centers and development hubs and development corridors in the very conditions of the 21st century. I was mentioning like the middle corridor where around the Caspian Sea, there are a number of other development corridors at play, sometimes just about energy or multi-sectorial in the African context and so on and so on. This is probably one of the way to continue think about a development and sustainable growth in the conditions of the 21st century now. So the more, I would say, refined expertise there will be, and the more government will be, I would say, pushed to support continuously this, including India, of course, which is one of the key overarching player in this system, then the more there can be benefits that could be widespread, not just limited to a number of locations or ports, even though those locations and ports are also critical nodes of the IMEC project.
On that note, we'll end things just 50 seconds before the deadline, so we save some time. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Peter, Nicholas, Bharat. Thank you all for attending, and let's go get lunch.
Many thanks to our distinguished speakers. We have two very special lunch conversations that we invite you all to. One is on the intersection of technology and geopolitics, and the other is on Ukraine and the future of Europe. To get there, go out these doors and turn right. Be sure to arrive on time, as seating is limited and will be on a first-come, first-served basis. Before you go, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, X, or LinkedIn to get updates and key insights from our event. We encourage you to share your thoughts and continue this conversation using the Budapest Global Dialogue, or BGD hashtags.